from San Jose, California, and brought to you by Think Tank Learning. Welcome to Meet the Experts. This is a forum in which we pick the brains of experts and professionals from various industries. We give students inspiration by showing them the academic journeys that they can imitate as they prepare to become experts themselves.
Welcome to Meet the Experts. Today we are going to talk about Shakespeare, law, and literature. Society often misunderstands the value of studying literature. In light of science, technology, engineering, and math, literature is sometimes considered as an impractical luxury of society. However, every time scientific inventions are abused or cause destruction, society returns to fundamental questions of life, morality, and ethics. It's as if we cannot escape the lessons that are told, the secrets that are whispered in the pages of ancient manuscripts. Our special guest today has had a distinguished career in the study of literature. She is Frances E. Dolan. Frances E. Dolan is the Distinguished Professor of English at UC Davis. Before coming to Davis in 2003, she taught at Miami University as well as the University of Chicago and Columbia University. Her research focuses on early modern English literature, law, and history, which is in the 16th and 17th centuries. While her interests are wide-ranging, she has a long-standing commitment to Shakespeare and his contemporary dramatists. In 2004 and 2005, she served as president of the Shakespeare Association of America. She has edited 6 Shakespeare plays. In addition, she has published 5 books and numerous articles in journals and edited collections. Dolan has held fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, specifically at the Newberry Library and the Folger Library, and the Monticello College Foundation. Most recently, she was the Fletcher Jones Foundation Distinguished Fellow at the Huntington Library. Earlier this year, Dr. Dolan was awarded the UC Davis Prize, which is given for undergraduate teaching and scholarly achievement. She is the first English professor at UC Davis to receive this $45,000 prize. Professor Dolan, welcome to Meet the Experts.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, to start, so I read the article about your UC Davis Prize, and so it seems like you were surprised in the middle of one of your lectures and somebody baked a cake for you. Is that right?
That's correct, and the cake was our whole syllabus in law and literature in cake. So it was all the books.
Okay. Oh, okay. So it was your syllabus. Okay, because I was going to ask you, as a literature professor, did you actually eat the cake or did you judge the books by their cover? Good, so.
We judged the cake by the books and the books by their cover, and then we ate it.
Okay. All right. Okay. So to start, can you tell us what the relationship is between Shakespeare, literature, and law?
Well, when Shakespeare wrote, many writers and many members of the audience would have had legal training. So Shakespeare takes up legal questions and conflicts in many of his plays. But more than that, some scholars have argued that Anglo-American forensics and the drama kind of grew up together. So that certain skills, like the ability to kind of take an incomplete set of information or an incomplete picture and conjecture from it what's missing and anticipate what might happen next or what would unfold from a particular situation, became central both to writing for the stage and to jurisprudence, and to both interpreting, writing plays and interpreting them, and assessing evidence for juries and lawyers. So they're really closely connected.
Wow, okay. Well, compared to then other famous authors of the past, what makes Shakespeare special for understanding the subject of law, I guess, aside from what you had just mentioned previously?
Well, if you look across the country at law and literature classes, many people will use a Shakespeare play as sort of their first text, right? They're going to move across time and up to the present, but they'll start with a Shakespeare play. And that's because in Merchant of Venice, for instance, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, you get a great question. You know, what's the status of an alien in society? What's the status of somebody who you require to do the dirty work, in this case, lending at interest, that other people don't want to do? Or in his play, Measure for Measure, he asks the question, can and should society police sexuality? So you can use his plays to open up questions that remain unresolved and then continue to think about those questions in later literary texts.
Wow, yeah. So what you just mentioned about in Merchant of Venice, the issue of how should we treat, I guess, an alien, right, within the borders. That seems to be still a very relevant issue today, right, in the recent elections. So, I mean, it's, I guess, do you often encounter these opportunities to discuss very hot button issues just from actually teaching these books?
Yes, I do. And this year teaching Shakespeare, I felt all over again this sense that Shakespeare identifies problems that we still haven't solved. And so because he is kind of a safe terrain to talk about them, right? It's not like talking about our current political situation in a very a direct way that can make people shy away. In a Shakespeare play, you can talk about these issues in a way that gives you a little distance on them, and therefore might make it safer for people from a variety of points of view to participate. But I think in terms of, you know, how might law and literature classes change over time, for instance. You know, I'm a Shakespearean, so I teach Shakespeare. Maybe my colleagues who aren't Shakespeareans wouldn't. But I think we're going to see some of the same questions I'm asking in Shakespeare in other law and literature classes, because that's a place where you can ask questions that seem newly relevant after the election, for instance. What is the United States, or what is the United Kingdom? You know, what's American literature? What's British literature? What links these two countries together in addition to their shared history? How do we think about all the language traditions and ethnic traditions that come together into these countries?
Mm-hmm. And so would you say that in English literature, that what we consider American, right, actually might have come from Europe initially, that we consider an American story, an American, you know, custom, things along those lines?
Yes, for sure. So we teach, in my department, we teach something called Literatures in English, and it goes across 3 quarters. And in the first quarter, you're talking about how laws, customs, terms, language come together to create what we now call England, and how that then moves to colonial America. But as the sequence proceeds to the end, we're seeing then the English language move all over the globe, and we're seeing all kinds of writers, for instance, and populations of readers come together in the United States and stake their claims to American literature and transform it in various ways.
Wow, yeah, amazing. Okay, so what would you say would be future frontiers in the study of literature, history, and law?
Well, you know, everything changes every minute. So I just mentioned that I think the very question, what is American literature, what is English literature, who is an American, those are questions we talk about in literature classrooms all the time, and they seem to me newly urgent. But another example I might give you is that if you look at the 16th and 17th centuries, as I do, one of the things you think about is the printing press as a new technology, a new information technology, right? It's not absolutely brand new in the 16th century, but by the 16th century and the 17th century, it's becoming so well established that popular cheap print is everywhere, lots of people can read. Printed matter is creating new cultural institutions like coffee houses where people exchange news, and the newspaper. And that's changing the political process. Wow. So it is really interesting to look at that at a moment when we're saying, wow, you know what? I think Twitter actually changed our election. Or I think that the fact that people with cell phones don't pick up when they don't know who's calling might have changed the polling process, right? So when you're looking at the transformative potential of technologies in terms of how we know things and how we engage in the political process, it's really interesting to look back at something that might have seemed very dry, the history of print. At another moment, suddenly seems urgent because we said, well, how did they handle that? These incredible changes in their political process and in how they learned things.
Yeah, wow, definitely. Yeah, it's very fascinating. That's right. You know, Facebook basically has changed many things. Even the revolution in Syria or Libya before then, right? So printing, yeah, I guess widespread printing would have Yeah, access to information.
So imagine the time right before that when you only knew something that someone wrote you in a letter or that you overheard. So suddenly, print is anonymously spreading. That's step one in the history that leads to us.
Wow, yeah, definitely. That's cool. All right, and so why would you say is it important that modern society understands history accurately?
Well, I think I first would say, you know, understanding history accurately is a really high bar, because in fact, we're always learning and relearning. So even something we think we understand about the history of science or the history of medicine or the history of politics, we're constantly revisiting and debating and trying to figure out what the past means. So it's not like it's there and we can either know it accurately or inaccurately. In fact, we're constantly learning it and relearning it and reinterpreting it. And what's valuable about that process of learning and interpreting is that I think the past haunts us, bears down on us in ways that we don't always understand. So the more robustly we understand our connections to the past, the better we can understand the ways it's still in us, it's still shaping us, it's still sometimes limiting our options in ways that we don't really grasp. And we can see, well, people have encountered these problems before. People have thought that they were in a moment of unprecedented crisis and chaos before. People have come up with different kinds of solutions. And so that can help us from falling into the same traps. It can help us appreciate change and foster change. And it can just help us understand that we can learn from, we're not cut off from those who have come before. We can learn from them in various ways.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Definitely. All right. And so you've edited 6 Shakespeare plays. Could you tell us which ones they are, and what were the greatest challenges in editing these plays?
Oh, okay. Well, I have edited Taming the Shrew, which is a play that never gets old in terms of teaching it. You can always get a controversy going in a classroom by teaching Taming the Shrew. And I've also edited 2 particular favorites of mine that I just taught this quarter, As You Like It and Winter's Tale, as well as Comedy of Errors, Time of Athens, and I'm leaving one out, Richard II. What I would say about editing, so those are the ones that I edited, and some that Taming the Shrew I chose, whereas the other 5 were part of a big Penguin re-edit of all of Shakespeare. So I sort of got the assignment, and I was lucky to get some I knew well and some I knew less well. I would say the challenge of editing is parallel to the challenge of teaching, which is figuring out what do people need to know and what is too much information, right? So even in terms of a page, what a page looks like, if you want a text that is teachable or that somebody who goes to the theater might pick up and bring home and read, you want to explain the unfamiliar terms, but you don't want to explain too much, because otherwise people are intimidated and they think there's so many footnotes and I can't actually even see what's in the middle of this page. So that's the trick. And I do think of that as very much a teacherly challenge. What do I need to tell you, and what should I just wait and see and not overwhelm you with?
Wow, yeah, so the way you describe how you go, the challenges of editing sounds like what a translator, would have to struggle with too, right? Translating, from another language into, I guess, English. Because then when I was in college, I read, for our literature class, our writing requirement, we read the Iliad, right? And the instructor, specifically told us to get one translated by Fagles. He said it'll be much more digestible to you guys, right? It was a complete, and then in high school I had read the one translated by the other person. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. But it was just so much more accessible, and and it was just so different. And apparently Fagles actually spoke Greek as opposed to just learn Greek or something like that. And that made such a difference, right, in terms of how accessible it was, and yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because I teach Beowulf in translation, for instance, in my kind of intro level class, and whether it's a translation that's engaging or not makes a big difference for students. And in some ways you raise an interesting question, which is that, for instance, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival is commissioning versions of Shakespeare's plays that are effectively translations because they're in modern English. And I have questions about that because I think a lot of what's most powerful about Shakespeare is his language. It's not what he says, it's how he says it. So I think that that really matters. But to say that for modern students, reading Shakespeare is a translation exercise, that does seem right to me. It's challenging in that way. But as a result, it's surprising to me how many students I have for whom English is a second or third or fourth language, and you would think that would make Shakespeare inaccessible to them. But many of them will say first, well, my grandfather translated Shakespeare into some other language, that they came to it as a translation project, or they learned it in another language first in school. But I've also had students say to me, because you move so slowly with Shakespeare's language, right? You focus so carefully, you think about each word, that for many students, Shakespeare's a breakthrough moment in learning English.
Wow, okay. Yeah, and so I guess for our students who are interested in, also graduate studies in literature, right? Is there, I guess, a requirement to learn another language, other than English?
Oh, yes, in graduate school, most graduate programs, they're not all exactly the same, but most graduate programs will require you to learn at least one language and often two.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so because in high school in California, standard requires that you have at least 3 years of foreign language, and so that in a way that's advantageous for future literature students, right? So
absolutely, absolutely. I think any language background, and honestly, my students who speak multiple languages, I think that's an incredible advantage that they have. And it sometimes feels like a challenge for them in terms of their reading or writing, right? But in the long run, it's a huge advantage.
Yeah, right. Okay, so what factors do you think prevent modern people from accurately understanding literature from the past?
Well, it's interesting that we've been talking about language. So one issue is that language changes. Now, this can become an incredibly fun and interesting thing to talk about. So this quarter I was teaching about cuckold jokes in Shakespeare. Shakespeare loves jokes about men's anxiety that their wives will cheat on them. And I'm talking about this as historical, right? This is something that you have to kind of understand to understand Shakespeare's humor. And then I learned that a standard insult right now for a man who's held in contempt is cuck. And that this is used often on Twitter, for instance. I had to be told this. I didn't know it. But that fascinated me because I thought, well, wow. So you have to explain this to truly understand what's going on in Shakespeare. But actually studying Shakespeare is going to help you understand the whole weight of history that's coming down on you when you get insulted with the term cuck. So language is something that stands between us, but also can link us, right? I think the very things that can make it seem different, because I ask my students, what's unfamiliar, what's shocking to you here, that can make Shakespeare seem as interesting as science fiction, right, or fantasy, because it's presenting a world that's unfamiliar. But I think one of the things that keeps you doing it is that in Shakespeare class, in a literature class, this is the place where you actually talk about things like, what does it mean to fall in love? How do you know you really fell in love? If you had to compare these four couples, who would you think is really going to make it? Who has the most, the greatest love? How do we deal with the death of a loved one? How do we understand what makes a legitimate leader and what the obligations of a ruler or leader might be to his or her constituencies? These are like big values questions. And they're ones that we can use Shakespeare to talk about. So we recognize the ways in which King Lear or Richard II are describing political systems different from ours, right? They're inherited monarchies. But the questions they're raising about how you move smoothly from one ruler to another or what makes a good ruler are questions we still want to think about.
Wow. All right. Wonderful. Amazing. Okay, well, if you're just joining us now, we are interviewing Dr. Frances Dolan. She is a distinguished professor of English at UC Davis. And so let's switch gears a bit and talk about your own academic journey. So our audience, most of the members of our audience are high school students, college students, and their parents. So could you describe your educational journey starting from high school?
Okay. I think my overview would be to say that my journey is all about finding good teachers who took an interest in me. And that's why I always tell students, go to office hours, right? Come up to the teacher after class, make a connection. Because it's hard for me to look at my experience in any way other than a series of relationships, a series of teachers that helped me. Now, part of that is, I don't think I actually went to a pretty good high school. So I envy my students who I think did. I had no AP. I had no debate team. I went to an all-girls high school that I don't think took female achievement all that seriously at that time. So I find it enviable that students come into college sometimes. I love it when they say, well, I learned all this in AP. What are you going to do that I haven't already done? I love that challenge. I love that sense of, well, this teacher already did this. Let's build on that. I think that's really enviable. But I didn't go to a great high school, but I think in high school and then in college, I found teachers who connected with me and made a difference for me and opened up opportunities. And those opportunities were often doing something extra, to do an independent study, or I was able as a college student to sit in on a graduate seminar. And that was really fantastic. And at each phase, I just decided, well, this is interesting and I'm good at this, and I think I'll do it for the next step. So I was in college and I was both a Latin major and an English major because I had a scholarship which paid the bills for being a Latin major. And then I thought, well, I got into a graduate school and I got a good graduate school and I got a fellowship. So I'll go for the first year and I'll see how that works out. So I wish I could say I had this complete long-term plan, but I didn't. I just each step of the way did the thing that made sense next, and that I thought I would enjoy the most. And then, one step led to another, and I found myself a college professor. But I think the turning points were all people.
Okay, and so earlier you mentioned that I guess your high school did not take female academic excellence seriously. I mean, did you encounter that then throughout your journey, and what I guess have you? What is your response now that you are in a position of authority, right, as somebody who teaches and who interviews and hires, right, the next generation of faculty?
Yes. Well, I was not the first generation of women to be succeeding in higher education, and my mentors were not all women, but a number of women really were crucial figures for me. So I was able to take Latin classes at a nearby college as a senior. There was a special exchange program with my high school. And the teacher I had there said, you know what, I hate to tell you this, but your Latin is not good. You are going to have to really step it up to be at the level you're supposed to be at. And that took enormous time from her. She could have just said, you're not qualified for this program, goodbye. So I think a number of women professors really helped pull me in, really helped make this career possible for me, and I'm grateful to them for that. And I think one of the things I take from that then is a sense that I'm responsible for reaching out to students and trying to pull as many students in who feel excluded or ill-prepared as I can. That's part of the job, is recognizing talent and trying to help students who maybe can't figure out how do I get from there to the next step, to help them figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so along the lines of that, I guess the care and the extra measure that you take to help your students. So you teach at UC Davis, right? It's a large public school, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this belief out there that it's hard to get attention from your professors because there's so many students, right? And so can you give us an idea of I guess things you do, or is that really the case, or is it?
That does not have to be the case. I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think that you can have a liberal arts college education at a big university with all the wonderful resources that a big public university gives you. You can have both, but you need to take the initiative to reach out to teachers. And that's where I think it matters to, again, come to office hours, speak to me after class. There are a lot of people who, they're shy and quiet. They don't want to raise their hand in a huge class. Fine. I have students who routinely email me after class. I was just thinking this. And I think, great, I'd love it if you would say that in class because it would make the discussion better, but I understand if you can't. And I'm really glad that you wrote to me. By the end of the quarter, I know who those people are, right? So I think taking the effort, however that works for you, because people have different personalities, to make the connection, I think that that is going to give you a richer college experience. There's no doubt about it. And part of that is not just, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about Hamlet, professor. It's also the people who have the confidence to talk to their professors, who view us as accessible. Those are the students who will say, I'm overwhelmed and I need an extension. Or, I don't understand this. I feel like I'm supposed to understand the instructions for this final, but I don't. And the students who are confident enough to ask for help will do better. So anything I can do to get students not to get isolated and ashamed that they don't understand something or they can't raise their hand, and instead to reach out however they need to do that, I think those students are going to have a better experience. And, I just finished a 77-person Shakespeare class. I know the name of every person in that class, and I don't think I'm unusual in that. So I think that teachers also want to know you, and the more you can do to help us, the better.
All right, yeah. And so definitely that is a concern that, we get a lot from parents, right? And in particular because a significant proportion of Asian students are shy, right? And they're reserved, and so they feel like they might not be able to, elbow the way up to the front, so to speak. So.
Yeah. Well, I loved the book Quiet, that book about introverts. And one of the things that I thought was great about that book is the way that it talks about different learning styles. And that was just really helpful to me. So I'm now careful to create opportunities like an online forum that a student who cannot speak up in class can use. And I find that then I'll come into class and say, on forum, Amy said this. Amy would never raise her hands and say that in class. I know that, but I don't say that. But it gives me a larger array of voices that I can draw on. And I think normally students seem pleased to hear their voices brought in a way that seems less threatening to them.
Mm. Well, yeah, it's great that you're such an engaging and conscientious professor. So
that's what makes the job interesting. That's why it's fun.
So does UC Davis? I guess your department is in the College of Letters and Science or Arts and Sciences.
Yeah.
And so do they have the general education requirements of no matter what major you are, department you are in, that you have to take a writing requirement too? And
yes.
and do you think that is what? I mean, we encourage, because the Davis probably offers a bunch of different classes that will fulfill like a writing requirement.
Yes.
Right? And so, do you encourage them to take a literature-specific class as opposed to, a writing requirement that is in a related, not necessarily literature field?
I think that students need, I really believe in writing across the curriculum, as they call it, because I think that students need to develop their writing skills in a variety of different kinds of classes. And most students should have a variety of different writing voices and styles, ideally, by the time they finish college. So I think that there are lots of valuable writing classes that students can take. But I do take seriously that I am a writing teacher, that's one of the crucial things that I do. And one of the advantages I have, and I wrote this book called 12th Night, Language and Writing, which is about using Shakespeare to improve your critical thinking and writing skills. One of the things that I think is helpful about teaching a literature class is when you get a topic that students care passionately about, you're able to help them learn to improve their writing in a very special way, I think. Because if you get students who care what they're saying and want to persuade, then you have a kind of motive for writing well. And I think that that's a huge advantage. So I think that students, the general ed requirements, there are diversity requirements, there are writing requirements, there are oral literacy requirements. There are all kinds of requirements about ensuring that students have a nicely diverse array of challenges and experiences in their education. And yes, I do believe in genetic requirements. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I often tell my students who are interested in going to the natural sciences, engineering. They often, from their cultural background, think that it's just a writing class is just something to check off the box, right? But I tell them something very surprising to them that in my experience with my friends, in academia and in the workforce, the people who end up being promoted to management positions are actually like the best communicators. They're not necessarily like the best at math or engineering, but they're actually the best communicators, right? Because the higher up,
please go on.
Yeah, and the higher up they go, the less technical work they do, actually, right? And it's about putting things together and communicating in ways that's clear, right? And so actually, and taking literature classes, right, actually helps a lot. You know what I'm saying? Even though you don't plan to be an expert in Shakespeare, right? But it helps be able to communicate clearly.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And, the other thing that I would just add to what you're saying, and in many ways you're answering your own, question about what's the value of this for students who aren't going to become graduate students in English. The other thing that I would add is that something that students don't always think about is that there used to be a whole layer of help for executives that has disappeared. People used to dictate, and the secretary would type something up and punctuate it all perfectly. Or there would be helpers who edited everything and cleaned everything up. Think of how much content an executive, for instance, or someone in any job produces at his or her own computer with no layers of editing. And we live with our own mistakes. But the truth is, we deal with people who notice those mistakes. So in fact, training students to be their own author, writers, editors, PR people, communicators, that's really important because you're on your own in a way now that you didn't used to be. So I think those skills are hugely important. We've also seen, it's amazing how many students I work with who have an English major or minor, but have another major in, say, neurobiology. We're seeing a lot of combinations of what might be called the hard sciences and the humanities, and I think that's a great combination because those students come out with a phenomenal skill set.
Definitely, yeah. So, before the show, we discussed, that a lot of Asian parents don't want their children majoring in literature, right, or something in humanities, right? They want, engineering and stuff like that, right? Biology in that school, right? And so you mentioned that there's more double majors, right? I mean, is there any other option other than double majoring in neurobiology and English?
Right. Is there any other option? Well, partly the English, our department keeps our major lean precisely so that there's room to combine it with another major. But we also see a lot of pre-med students, for instance, do a minor in English. I've had majors who also have a major in sustainable ag, in all kinds of different things. I mean, I'm constantly learning from them. Computer science, so we're seeing students make all kinds of different combinations. And sometimes they start out, I've got a major for mom and dad, and I've got a major for me. Or sometimes they think, I have what I think is the safe major, and then I have the humanities major for fun, or the English major for fun. But usually by the end of their experience, they have come to understand those majors as more closely linked. So the sustainable ag major that I just had in Shakespeare class, who's about to take children's literature with me as well, she's deeply interested in writing for a popular audience to help inform that audience of some of the pressing food system issues that we're facing. And so she's enjoying herself, but she also thinks of it as preparation for the writer and advocate that she hopes to be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I know a number of physicians who their regret in college was they didn't study something other than a science, because once they got into med school, it was nonstop science for a decade, right?
Exactly. And, we see the same thing if you think about events for alums. People who are physicians or research scientists they come back and they really, you know, enjoy talking, being in a book club or talking about something different than what they do for a living. And I think a huge thing that we do is prepare people to be learners and for life and engaging in the world for life. And so I hope that I'm giving students, whether they're my majors or not, students who take just one class with me, I hope I'm giving them a set of questions they can ask of the world. I hope I'm priming the pump of their curiosity. I hope that I'm giving them resources for when they have to distract or divert themselves or learn something new. You know, I feel that there's a lot that I'm giving them that I hope maybe they won't even understand how much they value it for decades.
Wonderful. So regarding, I guess, on the topic that we've been discussing regarding thinking skills and research skills, what would you say are the most common misconceptions that people have of humanities majors?
Well, I think sometimes people think humanities majors are just not good at anything else, right? So sometimes people think, so you tried to be pre-med and you struck out and here you are in English. So that's why I think it's so important to say how many fabulous students I have in my classes are also fabulous scientists. I think sometimes people assume that humanists are impractical. If they were thinking in any sort of sensible way, they would be business majors. And I think that that's not true. Many of them are busily acquiring and sharpening skills and engaging robustly in the world and preparing for their futures. And so studying English is part of that. It's not an escape from that. So I think they're practical, they're hardworking, they're good at lots of things, they're incredibly smart. So what aren't they?
Yeah, I think earlier you mentioned one of your students who, you know, I also studied sustainable agriculture and how she wants to be an advocate. And in many ways, often, you know, in science and the STEM fields, especially when you're working whether in workforce or in academia, sometimes there's conflict of interest or there's just a bias in the field, right? And the whistleblowers, so to speak, right, happen to come from what? The humanities and the social science, right? They study these issues, right, that historically have been a problem, and their job is to say, does no one recognize that that's a problem, right? Because in science, funding, you know, it is a strong force of what to say, what not to say, unfortunately. Yes, I said that, my science colleagues, okay, but that's the reality, right? And so oftentimes I've appreciated, you know, scholars in the humanities for being willing to, you know, speak up and you know, point out the elephant in the room, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, listen, if what I'm doing is training people who will speak up and blow whistles, that makes my peace with my career. That's a fabulous way of thinking about what we do.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so what advice do you have for specifically young women wanting to be like you one day?
Well, this goes back to, you know, in some ways what your parents want, what you want. I think pay attention to what interests you and try to figure out why. Why do you like some things more than other things? Why are you happiest with some tasks and not other tasks? I think paying attention to yourself and your interests is really important. Build your skills, and doing that means pushing yourself beyond what comes most easily to you. So I'll say one of my regrets is that since the instruction offered to me in the sciences was not very good, and that's not where I met the teachers who I connected with, I think I decided I wasn't good at science prematurely. So I hope that students will not decide that they're good or not good at something prematurely just because they're afraid of failure. So don't assume you can't do something just because you haven't done it so far. Take the risk of reaching out and connecting. People rarely regret doing that. Think of your teachers as your allies. So those are some of the things that I would recommend that they do. Okay.
So then what subjects should a high school student learn to prepare for a career in literature?
One of the things that's fun about being a literary critic is there's really nothing you could do that would not make you a better literary critic. So volunteer work, other classes that you're taking, everything you do makes you a better thinker, a more critical and empathetic participant in the world. So all of that is good. I think, though, if I would say there's one skill you could try to develop that would help you as a college student in general, as a literary critic or an English major in particular, it would be concentration. I think everything about our world tries to undermine concentration and the ability to simply get lost in a thought, lost in a book, lost in a task. So I really think that young people have to start working out concentration like it's a muscle. You know, trying to unitask on something every once in a while, seeing what it feels like to only read this text and not look at a million things flying across your screen. So I would really think of concentration as something you need to learn, that we all need to learn, and that you need to practice. And I would try to work on that.
Okay. So yeah, so earlier you said that you know, there's any experience you have prepares you to be I guess good at literature. And so could you comment on, you know, standardized tests, right? Have the verbal section, right? And a lot of students do have a hard time in that section. And then, but what is the relation to doing well in, you know, such a test versus actually, you know, being good in literature?
Right. That's a great question, because one of the things we know about standardized testing is that it's biased in various ways. And it can be, you know, some populations of students do better and some populations do worse. I think there is a kind of test-taking ability is useful to have as a college student. There's no denying that. So it's not like if you have that ability, you're not going to do well. You are going to do. It's going to be helpful. And I think the ability to concentrate, the ability to suss out what a question's actually asking you, or how to answer well within the limits of a standardized test, those are all really valuable skills. And people tend to do well on verbal who have large vocabularies, who've read a lot. So in some ways you take us back to the question of preparation, and I would say reading. Read as much as you can. Read everything. That's great preparation for being a humanities major, and especially an English major. I think, you know, when I was taking standardized tests, there was no preparation, really. There, like, you could buy a little book and you could go through that. That was it. And it's clear that now people do prepare for standardized tests, and, you know, because they do, it makes sense for students to do that as well. Is that answering your question about testing? Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's just an ongoing debate as to, you know, how valid is a standardized test score, because statistically there are biases as to, you know, which socioeconomic backgrounds, which factors actually correlate with higher scores. And so what really is the score measuring, you know? Right. And how often, you know, you know, in literature, are you required to, you know, solve or write a paper in, you know, 60 seconds for questions like that? I mean, this doesn't work that way, right? So
no. So what standardized test above all is standardized test taking ability. So it doesn't always correlate with what we do, which is messier and doesn't have multiple choices, and you can't fill in a bubble. And so it doesn't really line up. And at the graduate level, we find that most graduate programs really are not that interested in the subject test, for instance, for the GRE, because it doesn't seem to have that much bearing on how people will do.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. I mean, admissions offices, you know, consider it a necessary evil, so to speak, because there's the volume of applicants is so high, right? It's a way for them to quickly, you know, set standards, so to speak. So, okay. So, what do you think would happen if society, right? If no one in society studied literature anymore, what would happen to society?
That is a great, like, dystopian experiment. Imagine a world without literature. Well, you know, I want to distinguish studying literature from reading literature, because, again, I really hope many of my students will continue to be readers, whatever they do for a living, even if they don't become professional critics. But I think that a world without serious engagement with literature by either professional critics or amateur readers would have an impoverished vocabulary. It would have a stunted imagination. It would have a population with incomplete tools for problem solving. It would have grotesquely underdeveloped empathy. I think a world without literature would not have sufficient empathy. It would have dull critical skills. It would be gray instead of in Technicolor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, in having interacted with philosophers of science, and having heard debates between philosophers and physicists, and philosophers and chemists, and philosophers and biologists, and you'd be surprised, how who ends up getting the upper hand because of just having wrestled with the fundamental questions that we humankind has wrestled with for thousands of years, right? As opposed to assuming that just because I know a technical field, right, a highly technical mathematical field well, that I have all the answers to, right, what we've actually been wrestling with for thousands of years.
It's also interesting to see, in terms of people who look at both the history of science and the world of science fiction. I have a colleague, Colin Milburn, whose work on nanotechnology argues, among other things, that science fiction writers started to imagine possibilities of nanotechnology long before it was actually possible to build the technology. That sometimes the imaginative space is a kind of low stakes, low budget, open space where we can imagine possibilities before we then start to figure out the practicalities of making them happen. And that, again, kind of pumping the imagination. A world without literature would be a world where there were fewer labs for imagining alternative possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so there in the news, there's been talk about this concept called trigger warnings and safe spaces on college campuses. Could you define what a trigger warning is and discuss whether you think that actually enhances or hinders college education?
Well, my understanding of what a trigger warning is that it's not saying to a student, I might use a word that offends you, or I might bring up a controversial topic, right? That's not, I think, how trigger warnings are understood. It would be instead to say, in class, we're going to talk about something that might trigger your distress about an experience you've had. So, for instance, if I'm teaching Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, I might want to say, there's a violent rape in Titus Andronicus, and we're going to be in class discussing that rape, the mutilation of the victim, what happens to her. There might be students in class for whom that would trigger a personal experience that makes the whole discussion very upsetting or feel dangerous to them. So the idea of a trigger warning is just to alert them that that's going to be the case. So if that's something they don't feel they can participate in, they have the option of leaving. Mm-hmm. So I think it's understandably controversial, because the question can be, are we saying that anything upsetting is something we can't talk about in class? And my understanding is that it's actually the opposite, that it's in order to create a safe space in the classroom, you would alert students who might find the experience more high risk than other people in the class. You're going to alert them that there might be something they would want to walk away from. So let me give you an example. Maybe just talking about the rape in Titus, we can continue with that. Or if I'm talking about issues around race, for instance. If you want to have a good discussion in a classroom, you do not know what's going to happen. So if I open up a big question, I want students grappling with it. I don't want them saying just what they think is safe or expected. And therefore, I don't know what's going to happen when I open that can of worms up. So I have not really used trigger warnings. That's not something that I have done. But I can understand. I have occasionally had a student say, I left class because that discussion of consent and rape was just upsetting to me. I couldn't really listen to it intellectually because I was just too upset thinking about my own experience as a survivor of rape or something like that. So that's how I think it works. And I think it's often maybe misunderstood as a form of restricting free speech, when indeed I think it's aspiring to create a classroom in which people can openly discuss things, and those who feel at risk can remove themselves from that if they have to.
Yeah, and I guess the core issue would I guess come down to, in light of what you just said, how the topic that is taught is enforced, right? Does the student have the right to complain to the dean that, I don't think we should talk about this topic or this book anymore, right? Then,
right, that's exactly right. That's when the whole thing becomes more complicated, right? So I think the reason that it's controversial is where it seems to abut with the possibility of impinging on academic freedom. That we should be able to teach the texts and the issues that we want to in our classes. So I would feel bad if somebody said, imagine if I was teaching Shakespeare and I had to take out Titus Andronicus because of the rape, and I had to take out Othello because it's really very distressing the way it talks about race, and everything that makes those texts worth teaching in an extreme understanding, you could say would make those texts too dangerous to teach. So I think that's the concern, is that it could impinge on academic freedom. But I want to stress that that has not been my experience. I haven't seen that happening. I haven't felt under that kind of pressure. In fact, I feel students really wanting our discussions in class to matter to them. They want them to feel like something's at stake in the discussions, even if they sometimes are uncomfortable.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, maybe in the future we'll have a roundtable discussion, and we'll invite you back along with other faculty to discuss this topic, because our high school students will certainly run into it once they get into college. So, okay. And so there's a question that we ask every one of our speakers. So it's easy for our students to be inspired by someone like you, who's very successful, but it's also easy for them to be intimidated by someone like you. So we want to give you an opportunity to share, was there a time or times in your academic journey during which you felt inadequate or that you wanted to quit?
Many, and I really don't think any successful person hasn't had moments of thinking, I'm an imposter, I got into graduate school on a clerical error, I appear to be more stupid than the other people in this class, I'm never going to finish everything on my to-do list by the deadline, I'm in over my head, all of those things. I have felt all of those things all the time. And maybe what students need to realize is it's not like I've left that feeling in my past as a student. I, as a professor, frequently will think, I'll leave a class and think, all right, that didn't go the way I was hoping. Or a student asked me a question and my answer wasn't good enough. I have to come back with a better answer for that student. Or I'm learning our new, technology that we use, Canvas, and we just replaced our old learning system, and I don't get it, and I get things wrong, and then I have to explain that I made a mistake. And so I don't think that, I think part of trying to learn new things, take risks, take chances, is failure. And as a teacher, I'm trying to be a role model, because I fail or make mistakes or flub all the time. And I think that just goes with the territory. And at the new student orientation for Davis, I had a great experience, which was I had to follow an a cappella group and a dance team, which, when you come up as the professor who says, I think you should go to office hours after the dance team, they seemed like kind of a tough act to follow. But the thing I really wanted to say to all those new students is, if you get overwhelmed by the quarter system, or you suddenly realize that you have 5 papers due the same day, there's no shame in that. Start to talk to your teachers. Figure out if you could change a deadline, if you could get an extension. So the students who get stuck, who get paralyzed, are the students who do not feel that it's possible to admit being in over their heads or screwing something up, making a mistake, writing down a deadline wrong. Everybody makes mistakes, and the more you can be honest with yourself about that, the better you'll do. And any professor you're talking to has made enormous mistakes. So they may not be admitting it to you at that moment, but everybody has.
All right, well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I think that's the end of the Q&A with me, and at this point we turn to Alistair, our moderator for listener questions.
Hey everybody, I'm your moderator for this webinar, and we do have a couple questions from our viewers. The first one is from Jenny. Jenny writes, thanks for your time, Dr. Dolan. I enjoy literature very much and love to write. However, I often run into the infamous writer's block. What are some things that you do to get your creative juices running again?
Oh, that's a great question. What I do is what I call pre-writing. And that is, I'll say to myself, okay, you're not really writing now, you're preparing to write. And when I'm preparing to write, I'll do things like I open up either I do it on paper or I do it on screen, and I'll just say, well, I know I'm going to want to talk about this quotation. And I know, or if you're writing fiction, it would work differently. I tend to do critical writing mostly, so that's how I think. But it's like I ease the transition between not writing and writing by creating this middle space that I call pre-writing. And I found that when I help students with writer's block, this often works for them too, because pretty soon you have a document and you think, well, gosh, I have more ideas. And I say, when you're pre-writing, don't edit yourself. Don't turn it into an outline. Don't critique yourself at all. Just put everything down there you can. And before you know it, you think, well, wow, I have way more than I need. Now I'm going to have to cut this out. And before you know it, you're writing.
Next question is from Ben. Hi, Dr. Dolan. This might be a tough question, but what are the top 3 books you would recommend people to read that would completely change their perspective on life or change their beliefs?
Or change their beliefs. Oh my gosh. That is a tough one because I think it would be different for every person. I don't think there is a list that I could say that every person is going to be changed by that, because one of the things you learn as a teacher is I'll think this is a life-changing book, and my students will think, for you maybe, and they'll say to me, no, for me it was this book. So I think that is a tough question to answer because I don't think I have a definitive answer. So, and even if I think about books that made a difference for me in my life, you know, I loved Henry James' Portrait of a Lady, and I think that was the moment I was reading it, it came to me at the right moment. Like I had an interaction with that. I had a relationship with that book at that moment. And I wouldn't say that it's going to be a life changer for absolutely everyone.
Were there any recent books that you've read lately that you would recommend to our viewers to read for enjoyment or for learning?
I would recommend reading a graphic novel, and I especially like graphic novels by Alan Moore, so I would really strongly recommend Watchmen. Just so students have the experience of a different kind of reading. Now, students are often way ahead of that. You know, they're teaching me to read graphic novels, but I think the studious high school student who has never read a graphic novel really should. I think that's an incredible experience. Of Shakespeare plays, the one that I'm loving right now is Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, and that's unfamiliar. I also teach children's literature, and I think, you know, everybody has their own particular favorite, but a new one that students brought to me was Esperanza Rising, and I really loved that. So, I don't know, I mean, everything, whatever I'm reading, I think is fantastic. I love Victorian novels. I love Wilkie Collins. He's one of my favorite novelists. So you can't ask English professors this question because it's just like, you know, I see the clock is ticking away, but forget it. You know, I could just go on forever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's all the time that we have today. Thank you, Dr. Dolan, for spending your evening with us. Is there any way that our viewers can contact you? Do you have like a Twitter handle or any type of social media contacts?
I do not, I'm afraid, but you can see my page at UC Davis, and my email is there, and if people want to send me an email, I'm happy to respond. Okay,
great. Any closing statements from you?
No, it's just Dr. Dolan, thank you for your time, and I think our students will get a lot out of it, so definitely we'd like to have you back on in the future.
Well, thanks to you both. I enjoyed it. Thank you.